Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this public hearing. Our first item will be our opening ceremony. A pledge to the flag. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, so we have the draft 2025 Springettsbury Township Comprehensive Plan. Mark, do you want to open us up here?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we're finally coming, hopefully, to the end of this long process. But Marion Hall, who is seated next to Randall, is going to steer tonight's presentation on the draft comprehensive plan. So I will turn it over to her to explain the process and move forward.
Great, thank you. So I put together a fairly brief presentation to review the comprehensive planning process, the findings from the existing conditions analysis, and the recommendations moving forward so that we can kind of frame the discussion for tonight. So I'm just going to do a brief overview. What is a comprehensive plan? How does it work? And then talk about the other things that I just mentioned. So project overview. So we've done quite a bit of community and stakeholder engagement throughout this process. In the summer through early fall of 2023, we did a community survey that was available on the township's website and was advertised in the newsletter. It was at a variety of events in the park over the summer. We got about 200 responses to that survey, and that helped inform issues of importance to the township and things that we need to look at during the planning process. We held also in September 2023, we held a community workshop where we reported back what the initial findings were in the existing conditions analysis and a set of goals and objectives to implement as a part of the comprehensive plan. Got community buy-in on those before we went and drafted specific recommendations. And then finally, last fall and earlier this year, we met with the Planning Commission to review the draft plan, take both commission and public feedback, took that feedback back to the steering committee, and made a final round of revisions to the plan to get it in the format that it is before you tonight. We also, particularly in the initial starting of the project, but occasionally throughout the process, we interviewed stakeholders to understand what their needs and priorities and thoughts about the township that could help shape the plan. And finally, the plan development has been overseen by a steering committee that is made up of members of the Board of Supervisors, the Planning Commission, Zoning Hearing Board, and a number of community members and other committees representing the township. So in terms of the planning process, really worked in earnest on the draft plan itself between the public meeting in September of 2023 through last summer, and then really started looking at the adoption process. So as I mentioned, we presented the draft plan to the Planning Commission. There were a number of comments that we felt it was important to address. Took those back to the steering committee, and actually held that meeting was actually a joint meeting between the steering committee and the Planning Commission, and was very productive in resolving a number of issues and enabling us to move forward. So we took it again to the Planning Commission for a final review, where they ultimately recommended it for a public hearing before the Board of Supervisors and consideration for adoption. So just also, it's not a part of tonight's decision, but just know that we are continuing to work on the zoning ordinance updates, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. So just briefly for the benefit of the audience, talk a little bit about what a comprehensive plan is and what it does. It's a policy document, and it addresses several key areas that are of importance to this township and municipalities in general. So setting policies for housing, for economic development, natural and historic resources, land use, how you manage the use of your land, transportation, and community facilities and services. So a comprehensive plan is a long-range document, so it's not something that you revisit every year. Your last plan was completed in 2004, and a 15 to 20-year horizon is common in comprehensive plans. It in and of itself is policy, it's guidance, it is not regulatory, it is not an ordinance like your zoning ordinance or your subdivision and land development ordinance, although it does make recommendations for things you might change or address in those ordinance and other implementation efforts. So it's meant really to sort of help out with decision making as you're moving forward and trying to weigh decisions on direction to take in the future, coming back and looking at this. Does this meet the framework of where we said we wanted to go over the next 10, 15, 20 years? It certainly does prompt regulatory changes, and as I mentioned, we're working on your zoning and subdivision ordinances right now, so that's a very direct connection, but there could be other things as well. And it can help influence decision-making around capital projects. You know, what's a priority investment for us to make versus something that might be a longer-term goal moving forward. So I'll shift now to talk about what we learned when we were doing the existing conditions analysis. Our information sources included existing plans that the township has today, including, importantly, the 2019 transportation plan that the township commissioned. Talking to people, whether that was a steering committee, the stakeholder interviews that I mentioned earlier, some primary research, just getting out there and seeing what was happening, as well as secondary research. So what does the census what does the census say? We had a particular focus on economic development moving forward for the township, so we actually purchased data that takes census and other sources and provides a little bit more detail. And finally, state and county GIS information. So what do we find? Starting sort of at the top, in terms of land use and zoning, not a surprise to anybody at this table. There's not very much vacant land in the area of the township that has been targeted for future growth. So really, the focus of the township has been and will need to continue to be focusing on an effective reuse of underutilized properties, whether they're vacant or whether they have a business on them that is not necessarily healthy and contributing to the economy and that owner's financial stability. So what were some of the needs we saw to make this happen? Obviously updating and modernizing the zoning ordinance with some particular attention being paid to the town center overlay. Making sure that we have the right tools in place, zoning and other policy tools to support redevelopment of the Galleria Mall and other underutilized sites throughout the township. And finally, we do have a designated rural area in the township, areas that we do want to see stay in agricultural use and open space use, so making sure that we have the right policies in place to preserve that open space and agricultural uses. In terms of housing, we really found that the township enjoys a diverse housing stock, and actually that housing stock has become more diverse since your last plan in 2004, with a lot of high quality multifamily, townhouse, other kinds of development that was not common here in 2004. But we really still do see, like we did in 2004, the need to make sure we preserve our older homes, make sure that they stay economically viable into the future. A considerable portion of our housing stock was built before 1959. So, but we need to continue to diversify our housing stock so that we're meeting all life stages. So we do a great job with families in Springettsbury, and we're doing a better, stronger job, I think, with meeting young professional needs. We have some gaps to fill, I think, still in senior housing options, and that's been a priority throughout the planning process. So in terms of economic development, today, your economy is diverse and strong. You have a very large amount of retail in the township, and despite a lot of declines in the retail, the bricks and mortar retail economy, overall, Springettsbury is still doing very, very well in that area. But we want to make sure that we're continuing to make sites effectively available for infill and redevelopment. We want to consider ways to, repurpose particularly obsolete office space, but also that retail as markets shift. And coming back to the Galleria, identifying not just zoning, but other policies and partnerships that might be needed to support reinvestment in the York area, in the York Galleria and surrounding area. In terms of natural and historic resources, we heard both in public meetings and on the public survey that people really value the open space that is here in the township, and that it really contributes to a town and country feel that is important to Springettsbury residents. And obviously, some amazing park resources, not just Springettsbury Park, but neighborhood parks throughout the township. So some of the recommendations there involve, or some of the findings there involve, considering the recreation and historical tourism opportunities of camp security. It's probably something that's a very slow burn, but just keeping that on our radar. Considering stream and wetland protections to increase resiliency, also enable us to continue to comply with the requirements of the Chesapeake Bay water regulations there. And finally, making sure that we're staying on top of what we need to do to preserve our open space in the designated rural area. Transportation, not news to anybody here, but limited connectivity in the township caused by US 30 cutting across the township, topographic features, other things have created a lot of traffic issues in the township. And you've done a lot of work as a township to identify what those issues are. The comprehensive plan thinking is like, okay, let's look at all this information we have, and are there ways that we can identify priority investments to move forward so that it's not such an overwhelming task, but what are the things we need to do? What are the things we need to do first? And thinking about that, pedestrian and bicycle gaps are something to be thinking about, as well as updating policies and ordinances to support new technologies. Importantly, electric vehicles, but autonomous vehicles are another thing that's coming up. So just making sure that we're on top of that moving forward. And finally, with community facilities and services, another thing we really heard in the community survey was that the quality services offered by the township and the school districts here make Springettsbury a good place to live and work. So we want to continue that legacy in the future. One thing that could be considered is updating the parks, recreation, and open space plan. I think particularly with an eye towards some of the local neighborhood parks and access to those neighborhood parks, continuing to manage stormwater, and making sure that minimum lot sizes in the rural area are large enough to protect groundwater and other resources in that area. So, touched a little bit on some plan recommendation ideas as we were going through that. I'll do that in a little bit more detail, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, in terms of land use, primary land use recommendations revolve around the zoning and subdivision ordinances. So what do we need to do to make sure that we are supporting redevelopment and infill? How do we streamline the ordinances to make them easier to use? So the current draft that we're working on does quite a bit of that, but also trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, since we kind of know how to use our own ordinance. So not starting from scratch, but streamline things where they need to be done. Regulating emerging uses. We were not talking about short-term rentals. when we were working on this ordinance last time. Emotional support animals, backyard chickens, things like that. Not that they didn't exist, but they were not as big a deal as they are today. So data centers, looking at some of these uses and practices that are around today. And finally, revising the town center ordinance so that on our big projects, we're still able to use it to leverage investments for quality community amenities, but we're not discouraging smaller projects. So that's a real focus in the zoning update around the town center. I want to talk a little bit about land use policy changes in the plan recommendations and how those are shaping up in the zoning. As we were having conversations with the Planning Commission, there was a lot of concern over losing commercial land to residential uses. And a main concern that a lot of the land in the township that is available for a mix of uses could potentially all tip over to housing based on current market pressures, and we don't want to see that happen because we want to maintain that healthy balance that the township has already between residential uses, between retail and commercial uses and industrial uses. So we took a closer look at land use policy in the township, and the orange areas on the map got to get my pointer back. Oops. The orange areas on the map. There we go. So we have this bright orange color, which is the traditional mixed use zoning that I think we've mostly been thinking about in the township, which is a mix of commercial and residential uses. But we also want to talk about another kind of mix of uses that the township has a lot of, which is commercial industrial. And when we started looking at some of these areas where there's a mix of commercial and industrial uses, we thought a little bit about, is the activity here to change the zoning and make it either commercial or industrial? And we started looking more closely at it, and it was like, well, those hotels that are supporting those industrial uses, that's a nice mix. Being able to, run some minor commercial errands, on your break from a job is a good thing. So that's something that's important to maintain for the township, but we also want to make sure that that we are preserving that land for an economic use rather than a residential use. So from the land use policy map perspective, we now have two kinds of mixed use on our map, and one is commercial retail, the darker orange, and then the lighter peach, a mixed use that is commercial industrial. It reflects the uses that are there today, and it reflects a policy flexibility moving to the future that you could have either of those kinds of uses in that area without having to do a lot of change or work on that. So moving on to housing. So the direction of the recommendations talks about increasing the supply of new lower maintenance housing in walkable neighborhoods. This is the kind of housing that both younger professionals and seniors are drawn to markets. We want to make sure that we're serving well. Expanding housing options for a growing senior population, and this includes creating a zoning regulations for continuing care retirement facilities, communities, which are places where you can, in one place, you could go from living in an independent living, apartment unit where you have your own kitchen and your own everything, but maybe you get a meal or two out of a cafeteria, all the way up to memory care or nursing care, all as a part of the same facility. We don't have zoning in place today that allows that. So looking at zoning tools to make that an option in Springettsbury Township. So continuing to encourage affordable housing development, and by affordable I don't just mean housing for people who have lower incomes, but like housing that teachers can afford, housing that nurses can afford, housing that the professions that work in and near Springettsbury can afford. Again, tools to stabilize older housing stock and ways to reduce barriers to first-time homeownership. Something limited that the township can do itself in terms of the barriers for first-time homeownership, but there are a lot of programs offered by a lot of your private partners in banking and York County that we could make more obvious there. And finally, updating the zoning to manage newer kinds of residential uses. So in terms of economic development, seeking to continue to encourage diverse development opportunities to continue to support both the tax base and quality of life, encouraging reuse of the Galleria Mall with new residential, entertainment, and retail uses, building relationships with local developers and businesses to enhance retention and attraction, and finally, continuing to improve the quality of commercial development with urban design standards and infrastructure investments. Talk a little bit more about the Galleria Mall here because we do have a special chapter in the plan that talks about what we might do here. A recommendation to rezone this area of the township to support the kinds of mixed-use development that we saw a lot of support for during the comprehensive planning process, particularly exploring potential. This is a potential location for new types of senior housing, whether that's 55 plus multifamily or some elements of continuing care retirement communities could be looked at. Also. A recommendation that the township consider a tool called an official map, where the township can say where it would like to see future roadways or other public facilities in an area. The mall today is a big building in the middle and a whole bunch of parking around it. One of the things that's so enticing about that site as a new center to your township is that it is so near Springettsbury Park and other amenities. But people are going to have to be able to get off of that site safely, whether it's in a car, whether they're walking, or whether they're on a bike, to get out. So it may behoove the township to put together some kind of official map saying, this is where we want, trail connections. This is if you're going to build a street where it should go. That's how it's going to connect best into the township's existing network. So of course, employing design standards that consider both this internal circulation and connections to the street network, and one final kind of zoning thing. Permitting slightly higher residential densities to incentivize development. The land use recommendations in the plan call for a maximum residential density in multifamily housing of 15 units an acre. This is comparable to what was in your 2004 plan, but looking at considering up to 20 units an acre in the Galleria area as a way to incentivize redevelopment on that site. And then finally, just creating a framework for ongoing coordination. There's a lot of players on that parcel, whether it's the mall owner or Boscov's or the former Bonton site. There are a lot of folks to coordinate with there. So moving forward onto transportation, knowing that we don't own a lot of the roads that are here in the township, we're going to need to be able to work with PennDOT and others, primarily York County in its role as a metropolitan planning organization to implement priority transportation improvements, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Update the street classification map to reflect the 2019 transportation plan recommendations. It recommended some updates to what streets were classified as. That hasn't been reflected in a policy document yet. And then considering things like traffic calming on residential streets that experience cut-through traffic, you might be able to consider preparing a complete streets, safe streets for all kind of a plan, which would open up federal funding opportunities to construct improvements that are identified in that plan. There's a set of specific requirements that are required to be filled, and then it makes you eligible for a fairly new kind of federal funding going forward. So you could implement some traffic calming, some pedestrian improvements, and even some safety capacity improvements as a part of doing that. We heard a lot about the need to improve transit in the township during the comprehensive planning process. And honestly, a lot of that is beyond the control of the township. But one thing that is in control of the township is what we require of bus shelters and transit stop amenities. And a lot of what's in our zoning and subdivision ordinance today kind of discourage locating shelters and other things in the township, so we could make those a little bit more friendly to how Rapid Transit actually designs and installs those. It would encourage a little higher quality stop experience for your riders, and just generally coordinating with Rapid Transit. So quickly, the priority transportation improvements. So this was pulling recommendations out of your 2019 plan, testing them with the steering committee, testing them at the community workshop. Some of the highest priorities in terms of safety, particularly at intersections, included Mount Zion and Druck Valley, East Market and Vernon, Eastern and Mill, and North Hills at US 30, but also just overall on Route 24, the issue at multiple intersections of red lights being run. So in terms of capacity, a focus for capacity improvements include Memory Lane, Haynes Road, and Route 24, no matter what the street name is, as it goes through the township, and looking at ways to make those capacity improvements that also implement the pedestrian safety and other improvements that could open up a wider set of funding opportunities for that. So in some of the specific streetscape, bicycle, and pedestrian improvements that have been a focus during the planning process included multimodal considerations along our major roads, Route 24, Pleasant Valley, Memory Lane, and Memory Lane Extension, Whitford Road, and just generally the area adjacent to the Galleria Mall site. We have, the tail end of a regional trail in our township, so improving connections to the Heritage Rail Trail along the creek, as well as sort of last couple of block connections into some of your commercial nodes. So finally, on community facilities, we have a recommendation to update the recreation, parks, and open space plan. That was last completed right after your comprehensive plan was completed. Making sure that we continue to discourage urban style of development in the rural area. Considering the preparation of a resiliency plan. Previously, there was a lot of federal funding in that area. There's less now. That may be a lower priority for us. Continue to pursue new revenue sources to fund projects and services, which is something the township does well already, and just staying on top of making sure that we are doing the best possible management of our on-lot septic systems, so that we're not required to extend public sewer or public water into the areas where we don't want to see a lot of growth. Oh, one more. I promise this is the last one. Finally, in natural historic resources, continuing to implement stream and wetland protections, both for to increase resiliency from flooding, but also to control pollutant loads. Working with the Friends of Camp Security as they complete and then work to implement the recommendations of the Camp Security Master Plan, where those goals coincide with township goals moving forward. And finally, engaging the Historic Resource Commission to identify ways that local resource protections could be modified if they are needed to support the comprehensive plan goals and objectives. So quickly review the process here, and then I think we can move on to discussion. So the plan adoption process really started with the Planning Commission public meeting we held last November. That was a public meeting where we took public comment and got a lot of guidance on ways to update the plan. That feedback was incorporated, and then kicked off a 45-day review process where the plan has been available on the township website for general review by the public. It was also distributed to all adjacent municipalities, the York County Planning Commission, and both school districts that serve the township. We got very few comments back on that draft. Typically, in a process like this, we get a lot of comments from the County Planning Commission. They provided the bulk of their comments, between the planning commission, initial planning commission meeting in November and the 45-day review process. So they had a few editorial comments, but very minor. So we are today at the Star here at the public hearing. Obviously, there will be discussion and questions. Tonight, there may be feedback that we want to incorporate into the draft plan. As long as there are not major changes moving forward from that, the Board of Supervisors could adopt the plan at any upcoming Board of Supervisors meeting. So that is the process for finishing this step in the process, and then hopefully we're back before the end of the year on potential zoning updates.
Questions or comments? Wow.
Chairman, it's Charles. I want to commend Marion and her team for putting together the comprehensive plan. I think it really, when you look at the highlights that she's presented here this evening, she's really hit a lot of the things that we all had initially as some observations. Certainly all of the topics that she hit here. Of course, there's always some interesting changes on the horizon as you do a plan over the long, not only the process, but a long-range plan. And I just wanted to get a sense from Marion on particularly, we know about the I-83 route changes, and we've seen that as the construction is going on, that creates some traffic disruptions over there on 11th Avenue and so forth. Has the plan really given some thought of what the end game looks like, or how, one, the development of that interchange, that particularly exit 19, will have on township traffic and maybe overall economics, and two, the longer term impact in the plan?
We did look at that. We did look at that early on in the planning process, and I think the overall transportation recommendations have considerations for how you might address changes as a result of changes to the transportation network. But not, I think we all have assumptions of what may or may not change as a part of that, but until we see exactly what does happen, we don't have very specific recommendations for that. But I would it definitely falls under the category of, working with PennDOT and working with the York County Planning Commission, as these changes are implemented and as you are seeing, potential impacts, to leverage that change to help get, priority improvements for any impacts that were unanticipated as a part of that.
All right, thank you.
So I'll just make a comment. I know you were involved in previous comprehensive plan and have had a lot of experience with the township, and it's obvious that you were paying attention. So I appreciate the hard work that you put into this, and this is a very comprehensive plan.
Thank you. Started with a decent level of knowledge, which is always nice.
Marion, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but have you any idea what modifications you're recommending we make to the township overlay or the town center overlay? Because that's a big part of this.
Yeah, the big changes in the town center overlay. I think I alluded to trying to keep what we like about it, and it is pretty complex. But we've all figured out how to use big parts of it at this point. So, kind of not trying to throw out the things that we've learned to leverage to get what we want, but the irritating things like not allowing certain uses in the town center that it turns out we want to have there, fixing those. But the two biggies are around if somebody wants to come in and put a different use or even just a different tenant in something in the town center, and they're not expanding or they're barely expanding that parcel, making that a by right use, but applying a subset of the design standards that are currently in the conditional use, but things that are reasonable to do in an existing building. So not requiring people to like rip out the front and put in all new windows or, anything like that. So that's a big one of making, development within an existing structure and even allowing a little bit of expansion, a little bit of change to happen by right. So they don't even have to go through the conditional use process. The second thing is on parcels of 3 acres or less. You could do a whole new development, a whole new building, double the size of the building, whatever it is you're looking at. Still requiring it to go through the conditional use process, but not that master planning process. So not that whole, we're not getting very much out of those. So let's just not make them do that. So those are the big changes.
Thank you.
So, and a similar approach to the Galleria Mall. A lot of the provisions of the town center ordinance are exactly what we want to see at the Galleria Mall, but rather than making that be an overlay, make it a town center district. And the other recommendation for the town center overlay is to rename it the commercial center overlay, because the name town center was really catching people up because it's not. So the idea, so the idea that the Galleria does potentially have the option of becoming a true town center. So town center zoning there that is based on the provisions of the overlay today, but same thing about if you're not expanding the footprint of a building, if you're doing something on a lot that's, your parcel is 3 acres or less, not requiring it to go through that whole master planning process. So.
Questions or comments? I guess at this point, I'll open up for public comment. Anybody? Questions, comments? This will be, yes, sir, please.
Just something that was mentioned just this evening about
Name
the.
and address, please. For the
Glenn Young, it's in Springettsbury Township, 3421 Stone Ridge Road.
Thank you.
It was an interesting comment about the I-83 widening project and the impact that's going to have. It's a very large project, and it's going to take a number of years. It's almost like a 10-year project. And so how we go about planning for that is going to be very difficult. And I hope that this group will start thinking about what we're going to be doing in that area for the future. I don't think we have enough planning done at this point. And I think we need to coordinate a little bit more with PennDOT in terms of what they're doing. Now, I know their project changes. It seems like it changes by the day because of problems, but I think we need to be ahead of all that.
Thank you. Other comments from the public? Anybody on Zoom want to click the raise hand button? All right. Hearing none, I think you've done a great job, and I really appreciate all the hard work that you put into this. And thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Meeting adjourned.